I am live. Hi, guys. Pastor Trey here with our online Bible study, The Minor Prophets. We are now in our 10th session. 10 weeks. Wow, that's pretty cool. There are three minor prophets left. And all of these three are actually prophesying after the exile. A lot of the history of what's going on here can actually be read in Ezra. Ezra's got some pretty amazing history about coming back from exile. We find out actually that so in 538 BC, the king of Persia, Cyrus, he says, "Hey, Jews, you guys can go back to Jerusalem if you want to." That's found in Ezra 1, 2 Chronicles 36. And 2 years later, the first return happened. A man named Zerubbabel and one of the high priests, Joshua, I think he was the high priest. Anyways, they took, according to Ezra, they took about, I think about 45,000 people. Which meant about like 80,000 people stayed behind in Babylon. That's an interesting history in and of itself, and the fact that so many Jews stayed in Babylon, stayed in Babylon, and did not go back to Jerusalem, their homeland. Some people were employed by some of the princes in Babylon, and so they were comfortable. They didn't want to go back to their homeland because they had a job to do. They enjoyed their life. They had built there. So many people didn't go back. In fact, that congregation of Jews stayed strong in Baghdad. Babylon eventually becomes known as Baghdad when the Muslims actually take that as one of their important cities. And the Jews are able to stay there and thrive for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it wasn't until after World War II that they left there to go back to Israel. And so it's pretty fascinating that not everybody left the exile of Babylon. There are those who wanted to. Lots of priests and a lot of the people wanted to go back. And what we find out is that there are people who'd never lived there before because they were born in Babylon. They went back because that was the place of their ancestors. But some of the older people who were young when they left Jerusalem, they're coming back as old people. And you can imagine what it would look like to them. First of all, the fact that they're back in their homeland, that would have been overjoyed for them. But it would also be devastating for them when they actually saw the problems of what Jerusalem would have looked like, because it didn't look like what it used to look like. And so there's some mixed emotions there. Some people are really happy to be there. Some people are kind of sad as they see that, like the temple, for example, wasn't as glorious as it used to be, and things like that. So anyway, in 536, there's a first return. There's three waves of returning to Jerusalem. And so it was more like a trickle rather than a big floodgate opening. And the first is Zerubbabel, and they have basically, they begin to work on the temple. They built the foundation of the temple, and they built the altar. And they were immediately opposed by people who had come to enjoy the land where the Jews weren't. And now the Jews were coming back, and that was kind of something that they didn't like. And so they were trying to discourage the people from building. And yet there was this edict from Cyrus to say, no, these guys have permission to build. Now, 16 years later, once Cyrus dies, a new king is there, Artaxerxes. And the people say to Artaxerxes, look what's happening here. They're rebuilding the city, and this city has a history of being rebellious against other kings. And so it would not be a good idea for you to rebuild. And so Artaxerxes actually throws an edict out there that says you can't build anymore. And for 16 years, they stopped building the temple. Now, during those 16 years, though, they would build houses for themselves. And though it was kind of a bummer, at first for them not to be able to build when that edict came from the government, from Artaxerxes, that you can't build your temple. It seems as if the people got used to that. At first they might have been upset, but over the course of 16 years, they just kind of figured, I guess we just won't have a temple. And they began to just live their lives, focusing in on themselves and their own comfort and their own luxury. Enter in two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. Okay. Haggai is an older guy, Zechariah is a younger guy, and God gives both of them this prophetic message to give to the people. It's time to get off your butt and rebuild the temple. And what I find is fascinating is they stopped the temple building because the government told them to stop. So they wanted to obey the government and they didn't want to get into trouble. But when God sends these prophets to tell them it's time to start rebuilding the temple, God doesn't allow them to use that excuse. God says, I can't believe that you guys have stopped building, and all the while you're building your own homes and paneling them and making them look nice. You have neglected my house. And again, he doesn't let them use the excuse of, well, the government wouldn't let us do it. And so, so that's ultimately Haggai's prophecy, his encouragement, his chastisement to the people. It's like, get up and build the stinking temple already. All righty. It's only 2 chapters long, so I'll probably read through it and comment on the way, if that would be okay with you guys. I think that would be kind of a neat thing. So we're in, we're in Haggai chapter 1 on the first day of the 6th month of King Darius. So after one more thing that I forgot to tell you. After Artaxerxes had told them they couldn't build, Artaxerxes was then no longer the king, and a guy named Darius became king. And the governor of the region of Judah sent word to King Darius and says, is it okay for these guys to start to build again? Because they're starting to build. And Darius actually shows them favor. He goes back and he sees the edict from Cyrus, the original edict, and he realizes that, oh my goodness, we messed up, because Cyrus said that these guys could go back and worship their God and rebuild their temple. Now, for him, it was kind of a selfish thing, because he wanted the Israelites' God to be on his side. He wants to treat them good, and so that maybe their God would treat him good. But under Darius, they were actually able to do this again. So this is all what's happening. That they have not started yet. Artaxerxes had told them to stop, and Darius had not yet told them go ahead and do it. It's during this time that the governor was asking Darius, can they do it? Because of what Haggai is challenging the people on. Alrighty. So this is the first day of the 6th month of Darius' 2nd year. The Lord's message came through Haggai. And this is what the Lord of Heaven's armies, or the Lord of hosts, have said. These people have said, oh, the time for rebuilding the Lord's temple isn't come yet. Well, obviously, they were waiting for some kind of edict from on high. Don't blame us. It's not time yet. We're not allowed to. But the Lord's message says, verse 4, is it right for you to live in richly paneled homes while my temple lies in ruins? That just shows their heart was that they weren't hot to trot to rebuild the temple. Let's just put it that way. They were content with making their lives comfortable, but neglecting the things of God. So here then is what the Lord of the Heaven's army, or Lord of hosts, says. Think carefully about what you're doing. You've planted much, but you've harvested little. You are eating, but you're never filled. You're drinking, but you're never thirsty. You put on clothes, but you're not warm. Those who earn wages end up with holes in their money bag. Ultimately, God is saying, remember my original promise, that if you obey me, if you put me first in your societal life and in your individual lives, I will bless you. He said, you know what? You think that you're doing fine in life, but if you really look at yourself, you're really not being fulfilled, are you? There's a reason that you're not being fulfilled, and that's because you're just focusing in on you. You think that you're making life comfortable for you, but if you'll just pay attention to me, says God, and if you just follow my rules, I will make things good for you. Verse 7, moreover, this is what the Lord of hosts has said. Pay close attention. Go up to the hill country, bring back timber to build the temple. Then I will be pleased and honored. Then you can expect a large harvest where there used to just be little. And when you bring it home, that harvest home, I blow it right away. Why? Because my temple remains in ruins, thanks to each of you favoring his own house. He goes on to say, this is why I've withheld the dew, and there's a bit of a drought and a bit of a famine going on, because you have neglected the things that I would want you to do. Now later on, we find out that God was never supposed to live in a home built with human hands. Stephen in the book of Acts tells the Jews that we're to be his temple, and so there's going to be a little bit of a parallel to that. But God is basically saying it's not just the fact that he doesn't have a home. What he's saying is that there's really you have not really put a lot of effort into your spiritual life. You have not put a lot of effort into your relationship with me. Yeah, you think everything's going fine. It could actually go better if you would just do that. So that's Haggai's message. Verse 12 tells us the response of the leaders. Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and the high priest Joshua, son of Jehozadak, along with the whole remnant of people, they obeyed. They obeyed. They responded favorably to the message of the prophet Haggai, who spoke just as the Lord had told him to, and the people began to respect the Lord. See, that was it. They weren't respecting it. That's what this whole thing was about. Not the fact that God didn't have a house. God doesn't need a house. But it just showed that their hearts were not respectful. They were not trying to cultivate that relationship with God. So Haggai says, God is with you. And so the Lord, verse 14 says, energized and encouraged Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, the high priest of Joshua, son of Jehozadak, and the whole remnant of the people. And they came finally to work on the temple. And this took place on the 24th day of the 6th month of King Darius's second year. Obviously, this is what now prompts the Persian governor to ask Darius, can these guys do this? Is it permitted for them to do it? Now, chapter 2 says on the 21st day of the 7th month, so this is a month later, maybe a month and a half, about a month later, the Lord's message came again through Haggai. And he says, ask Zerubbabel and Joshua and the remnant of the people, verse 3, who among you survivors saw the former splendor of this temple? How does it look to you now? This is nothing by comparison. Now, it may seem like God is complaining. He says, man, this doesn't look anywhere like Solomon's temple. Well, duh. Solomon had riches beyond belief. There were many more people in Israel who could contribute to the building of the temple. And so this is going to be the second temple, it's going to be nice. It's not going to be anywhere near as nice as the first temple. It seems like maybe God is complaining, but he's not. He actually knows what's in the heart of some of the people who they are complaining. So he says, take heart, Zerubbabel, take heart, Joshua, take heart, all you citizens, begin the work. I am with you. Basically, God is saying it doesn't matter if it's not going to look as good as the first temple. That doesn't matter to God. It's going to matter to some of the older people who are very discouraged. And at one point, as they started to do this, there's two responses. The younger people, they are cheering. They have this temple to God again. And then you have the older people who are weeping loudly because this is nowhere near what Jerusalem used to be like. The temple is nowhere near as glorious. But God says it doesn't matter. I am with you. And that's all that really, truly matters. Keep working. Do not fear. Verse 5, I made a promise to your ancestors when they left Egypt, and my spirit now testifies to you. In just a little while, I will once again shake the sky and the earth, the sea and the dry ground, and I will shake up all the nations, and they will offer their treasures. Then I will fill this temple with glory. Okay. See, the first temple was built when all of these nations came around and helped Solomon by donating cedar and these all these different cool things to put into the temple of God. God is saying, I know that it doesn't look like that temple, but I am doing a work where one day my temple will be exalted again, and I will be bringing people from all over the world into my temple. At that point, this is a messianic prophecy. This is what Peter saw on the day of Pentecost, when he says in the last days, God's going to pour out his spirit on all people, not just the Jews, but on all people. And in Corinthians, in Ephesians, when Paul was talking about how God was creating a temple by bringing Jews and Gentiles together in worship of him. That's kind of what this is foretelling here, that one day everything's going to be shaken and all of the nations will offer their treasures, just like they had done in David and Solomon's day. And the silver and gold will be mine, and the future splendor of this temple will be greater. The future splendor of this temple will be greater than in former times. See, the only way that that's going to happen is if he's not talking about the physical temple, because the second temple will never be as grand and glorious as the temple that Solomon made. And in 70 AD, that second temple is going to be torn down by the Romans as they came in and slaughtered Jews at that point. The future splendor of this temple will be greater than that of former times. The only time that that's going to happen is when actually God dwells in his people, in the midst of his people, in our lives, in our hearts, not in a temple made with human hands, in stones and things like that. And in that place I will give peace. So then on the 24th day of the ninth month, this is verse 10, on the 24th day of the ninth month of Darius' second year, this is another couple months later, there's another message that comes to Haggai. This is what the Lord of hosts has said. Ask the priest about the law. If someone carries holy meat in a fold of his garment, and that fold of his garment touches bread or a boiled dish or wine or olive oil or any other food, does that item become holy? Okay, so you have holy meat in the fold of a garment, and the garment then touches something else. Does that make that other thing holy? Does that holy meat touching a garment, touching something else, make that something else holy? And Haggai said, the priest then said, no, that's not what the law says. That does not make that clean. He says, verse 13, but if a person who is ritually unclean because of touching a dead body comes in contact with one of these items, does it become unclean? Yes, it does become unclean. Wow, what an interesting illustration, an interesting message. If I take something holy and put it to something else, does that make that thing holy? No, it doesn't. But if I take something unholy, unclean, and touch something with it, does it make it unclean? Yes, it does. Okay, so what's the point? Well, it means that unholiness is catching. It's contagious. Holiness, just because you've got something like, like a temple, that doesn't necessarily, just because you have a temple, doesn't necessarily make everybody holy. You put something unclean in a temple, it'll make that temple unholy. But just because you have a temple amongst you does not necessarily mean that you are automatically going to be righteous and holy just because you have the temple. That's the point that's going to be made here. Verse 14, Haggai said, the people of this nation, Jerusalem, Judah, God's people, are unclean in the Lord's sight. So is their effort. Everything they're offering me is unclean. Now, therefore, reflect carefully on the recent past, before one stone was laid on another in the Lord's temple. So they've been building, and he says, now think, before we started this building project, from that time when one came expecting a heap of 20 measures, there were only 10. When one came to the wine vat to draw 50 measures, there were only 20. I struck all the products of your labor with blight, disease, and hail, and yet you brought nothing to me, says the Lord. So think carefully about the past. From today, the 24th day of the ninth month, to the day on the work on the temple was resumed, think about it. The seed is still in the storehouse, isn't it? And the vine, the fig tree, the pomegranate, the olive tree have not produced. What he's saying is, listen, guys, just because you're building the temple does not mean that my favor will be on you. It has nothing to do with just having a symbol of me there. I need to be there as well. And when you actually invite me back into your lives, I will begin to bless you. That's the last part of verse 19. Then the Lord spoke to Haggai a second time on the 24th day of the month and tells Zerubbabel, the leader, I'm ready to shake the sky and the earth. I will overthrow royal thrones and shatter the might of earthly kingdoms. I will overthrow chariots, those who ride on them, and horses and their riders will fall as people kill one another. And on that day, I will take you, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, my servant, and I will make you like a signet ring, for I have chosen you, says the Lord of heaven's armies. Now, what's amazing about this is Zerubbabel is going to be a signet ring. Now, signet ring would be a symbol of a king's power. And so God is saying, I'm going to be working through you. You're going to be my chosen one to continue to lead my people. At this point, folks, Zerubbabel becomes a picture of the Messiah. Because as God's going to shake the nations later on, Jesus Christ becomes the representation of the King of Heaven as God puts on flesh and dwells among his people. He becomes the image of the invisible God, according to Paul in the book of Colossians. And so Zerubbabel becomes a type of Christ, a type of Messiah. And so that will be something that people will be watching for in the future blessing for the people. Jehovah God, Yahweh, instructs, basically he says, listen, I'm using Zerubbabel, here, I prophesied concerning Zerubbabel, that he was going to overthrow the rulers of the nations of the earth and defeat their armies by turning against them. And when he does that, Zerubbabel, his servant, and that's a title given to the Messiah, would become the representation of God being used for a special purpose, designating God's authority and ownership on his people. You see, God had chosen Zerubbabel to designate this authority and the ownership. Zerubbabel would designate the coming Messiah. So through Jeremiah, and in the book of Jeremiah, God revealed through Jeremiah that if Jehoiakim, who is Zerubbabel's grandfather, he was a signet ring. He took it off and gave it to Nebuchadnezzar, so that meant that the power had shifted over to Babylon. But now the power is coming back to Israel, to Judah, and through one of Zerubbabel's descendants, that signet ring will represent God's authority and majesty and messiahship there in his people. So Zerubbabel is representing the Messiah at that point. So anyways, that's Haggai. This final oracle promises that one day God's going to gather all the nations and all the gods and the leaders of the Gentile nations will be done away with, and the Gentiles will be brought into the people of Israel. They will be part of God's plan, and so anyway, that's about it for Haggai. We got two more. We will look at Zechariah next week, and then finally Malachi, or as many people have said, Malachi, the Italian prophet. Anyways, love you guys. I hope this was kind of an enlightening lesson. Not a lot of inspiration necessarily, unless God's speaking through you. It's more important for God to have a relationship with us than just things that seem to be sacred, because just because we have sacred things around us doesn't make us sacred at all. Just because we're listening to Christian music doesn't make us sacred. Just because we don't do what our pagan neighbors do doesn't make us sacred. It's when God dwells in us and with us, and we have that relationship with God, that is the only thing that makes us sacred. So, anyways, that and the fact that it's okay to live in paneled houses. God didn't tell them to leave their paneled houses, and that would have been, signifying wealth. And he says, but just don't forget me. Make me a priority, because in those 16 years they had not made worship of God a priority at all. And God says, that's not good. You think you're blessed now, you'll be blessed even more if you'll put me as your priority. So I guess if I was preaching, that's kind of what I would be talking more about. Alrighty, hopefully you guys are staying safe and healthy and all that. We're getting ready to talk about phase two and what that's going to look like whenever that is declared by the governor, and we will hopefully be able to see each other soon. Love you guys. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.